Okay, hello, everyone. We're going to start on panel 6. And hi, how are you? Informal taxation and everyday fiscal lives. I think we'll just jump right in with our panelists. We have a combination mainly online. Hello, everyone. Hello, everyone. And it's great to be together in the ways that we can nowadays. So great to be here. So our first paper will be Miranda Shield Johansson from University College London. And the title is Fiscal Impositions and Creative Survival, Money Management Amongst Low Earners in Para-Urban Bolivia. Okay, so Miranda, you can just jump right in.
Thank you so much, Julia, and thank you, Gayatri, as well, for organizing all this so smoothly. It's great to be here, even though it's hybrid from London. I wish I could have joined you in person, but life doesn't allow for everything. So today I'm going to talk about my work on taxes in Bolivia. And this is some work that I've been doing for, let me just... There we go. Can you see the PowerPoint okay? It's always different in your own screen. Does it look fine?
Yeah,
great. Thank you so much. So yes, this is ongoing work I've been doing in Bolivia for the last 8 years or so on fiscal relations specifically, but I've been working in Bolivia on labor relations for the last 17 years, more or less. So the paper I'm going to talk about now really addresses a key questions about how people working in Bolivia's informal economy manage the pressures of the fiscal system and creatively balance its demands with the existing rhythms of their own incomes and their own ethics of risk and profit sharing to make ends meet. So when I've been looking at fiscal relations in Bolivia and also in the UK and Sweden, I've been looking at a lot of different perspectives, and not only from people working in the informal economy and not only seeing tax as an imposition. But what I'm kind of interested in today and in this work is specifically looking at low earners and how they manage kind of new fiscal systems that are very top down, and how they make ends meet within these systems where fiscal systems assume a lot about their own economic activity that might not actually be correct. So just to give you a bit of background, this work is based on field work I've been doing with taxpayers or potential taxpayers in Primero de Mayo, which is a suburb of Cochabamba City in Bolivia. It's a low-income neighborhood where most people, earn below or at the minimum wage. The land in these peri-urban areas is often of mixed designations. So some of it's designated rural and urban, and this is actually a really important part of the tax story, even though I'm not going to talk about it that much today, because the designation of land is key to the ownership of land and how land can be used for speculation and profit making, and that in turn is key to how it is being taxed, or the other way around, how land is being taxed enables it to be used in different ways financially. So my research participants usually they all live in Primero de Mayo, but they come into town and work as well. They work in the informal economy, mainly in the markets, either in the big markets in the city center or on the outskirts in their own neighborhood, Primero de Mayo. A lot of women also engage in domestic work. A lot of men engage in seasonal construction work. And there's also continued agricultural work going on in the rural areas from where many of them come or their families have come from. So they have a very mixed kind of economic activity base and don't rely on simply one source of income. And the methods have been participant observations. So since 2017-18, I've spent different periods of time in Cochabamba City, in these peri-urban neighborhoods, just spending the days in the markets, also with people in their homes, going to church on Sundays, going to political meetings, all the things that us anthropologists try to get up to. And this has also been complemented with interviews with tax collectors, either those who work collecting commercial license fees or taxes, also those who work in the tax offices who are more interested in income tax or VAT, and also people who work with the municipality registering property for tax purposes. So just to give you a little bit of context as well in terms of Bolivia's economic situation. So in 2022, the country's GDP to tax to GDP ratio sat at 23.7%, which is far lower than the OECD average of 34%, but actually is does quite well in the context of the region, which has an average of 21.5%, Latin America and the Caribbean. However, the personal income tax, or Bolivia actually has a kind of VAT income tax. It's got a slightly different type of income tax, which allows for different levels of deductibility, but only represented 0.2% of GDP, which is incredibly low compared to OECD countries. So some of the work that the tax office have been doing in Bolivia, the Impuestos Nacionales, is to push to expand fiscal revenue, specifically with regards income, so tax on labor, through simplified taxation regimes, digitalizations, and then campaigns about fiscal responsibility. So you can see here some of pictures of their quite new offices. So they remodeled and rebranded the whole tax office about 6 years ago, with a lot of this coloring of blue and white, a lot of compared to other official offices, the desks are very clean. There are no posters up. It's very highly kind of managed, the branding of these offices. And then they have these campaigns about fiscal responsibility, which is a lot about convincing people to pay in towards the common good and towards universal benefits. So part of their kind of aim to get people to pay specifically income tax is these simplified regimes, and also move to digitalization. And this is partly to try and to simplify things, but also to try and capture evasion. The problem is that, as with a lot of countries in the global south, one of the big populations that they're trying to capture are low earners who work in the informal economy. So the digitalization kind of creates issues for a lot of my research participants, which are fairly obvious and predictable, such as access. So a lot of people they might have phones, but they don't have enough data. Logging on, logging off, especially when in rural areas, proves difficult. So reception issues, and you can go into the offices themselves and use their kiosks. But a lot of people don't like doing this. They feel very uncomfortable in these offices. And also you need to be, these offices, although actually there had been an office that opened recently in one of the neighborhoods a little bit further from the center, but most of them are in the center. They're not in the areas where people live. And another thing the tax office pushed was this new régimen tributario simplificado, which is a simplified regime specifically aimed at getting the informal sector, so a lot of my interlocutors, to pay some element of income tax. The idea was that it was a very simple regime and that the fiscal burden was low. So the amounts they were paying weren't going to be very high. Also, they'd be exempt from collecting receipts, as tax was levied on capital rather than the income. So in the simplified regime, they weren't expecting people to either issue receipts or collect receipts or do any kind of formal, sorry, I'm just gonna have to move this, tax return. They simply submitted the amount of capital they judged themselves to own, or they were judged to own by a tax official, and then would pay a bi-monthly amount based on this capital income. So however, this involved a bi-monthly engagement with an online account. So this was a presumptive tax system, and you paid an identical amount each throughout the year, regardless of what you earned. And as long as your account was active, so as soon as you'd opened your account, you had to engage with it on a bi-monthly basis. And if you paused without officially cancelling it, or if you didn't engage or pay your bi-monthly amount, you could be fined. So to come to my research participants and the taxpayers. So this is Hilda, who lives in Primero de Mayo. She had been asked to join this régimen tributario simplificado, and her tax, what she owed on tax, would be calculated on her capital. So in this case, it was her pickup truck, her umbrella, and the stock she owned. However, Hilda's income varied a lot throughout the seasons. For instance, the seasons that she sold peaches are quite profitable, whereas watermelons offer a far smaller profit margin. Hilda also returns to her home village several weeks at a time during the year to plant and harvest, which makes her worried about not being available for these online bi-monthly payments. So she decided, although she had once opened an account, to then close it at a point where she was actually earning more money because she was worried about periods when she would be away. And during these times, she had no income and poor access to the internet. And she was very concerned with the fines that were being issued, so-called multas, or multas in Spanish, which were, I have to say, anecdotally, incredibly prevalent amongst people who I spoke to, that it wasn't only that the multas seemed to be generated by tiny mistakes made, and even if people were sure they hadn't made a mistake, but suddenly they sat there with a fine anyway. So there was this fear that the system was producing fines regardless of how well you try to interact with it. So it was almost impossible to kind of manage your taxes well. Her pickup truck, even though it was capital, was tied up in complicated sharing of money with kin and her wider community. So her tax burden was calculated on ownership of this pickup truck, but in fact, her income didn't reflect the capital that she owned. So for Hilda, her capital held was not a good measure of her ability to pay tax. And another one of my research participants, Ulupica, who was a butcher in Primero de Mayo. Does it say 5 minutes or 2 minutes?
5.
5, thank you.
5. Yeah.
So Ulupica's capital and income varied as well. He had a small shop that he rented, and he also worked as an occasional wholesaler. His many income streams and unpredictable profits and debt meant that he saw the simplicity of the régimen tributario simplificado as a difficult fit. The fear of fines because of the incommensurable rhythms of the expected taxes to pay and his various income sources. And he also pointed towards different kinds of money flows and incomes. And I think this is really interesting when we think of fiscal systems. And this is something I've written a bit about more, how different types of money and the rhythm of this money works better or worse for different kinds of sharing or extraction. So Ulupica said, the system penalizes you when your income is uneven and as soon as something is out of date. They think we get all the money like when you work in an office. Buying meat is not like working in an office. So I like to think about this in a way as wild money flows and creative survival. Ulupica wanted to put his money towards his lorry, which he co-owned with extended family, and not toward taxes. And I don't think this is just a kind of Ulupica making a classic libertarian critique of taxes, or that we should read his perspective like that. Instead, Ulupica was clear that paying taxes was the anti-social act, while keeping profits and allowing them to feed into the work of their kin and neighbors was the ethical choice, and ones that resonated with rural practice of sharing. So remember that people often live in these peri-urban neighborhoods in communities that also overlap with rural communities where they come from, and where there's already a lot of sharing of resources going on. So this sharing continues between these peri-urban and rural areas. So by investing money into businesses belonging to kin networks, including ritual kin, such as godparents, both profit and risk becomes shared elements of economic life. Pasanaco, which is a rotating system of loans and credit, and which is common in Bolivia amongst middle-class people as well, amongst lots of groups in Bolivia, is crucial to financial success. And Nico Tassi has argued that the so-called Amara bourgeoisie has made a lot of their financial success has really been down to this practice of Pasanaco. And Pasanaco is one articulation of the kind of risk and profit spreading that my research participants in Cochabamba engaged in on a regular basis. So whether the money circulating between them was seen as a loan, a gift, or an investment, it was understood as a means to safeguard livelihoods and grow profits. So to conclude, fiscal systems do not fit with the actual flows of money going on in Primero de Mayo. And engaging with fiscal system comes with the risks. So taxes are experienced here as interfering with the pooling and sharing of resources and existing money management strategies. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And also, there was no need for my time. You ended before time. Thank you so much.
Thank
Our
you.
second paper, yeah, our second paper, excuse me, 1 second, just catching up here with my notes. We have the title is here, Beyond the State, right? Beyond the State, but supporting it, informal tax institutions and state legitimacy in the DCR. And our authors here are Yannick Lokaya Bokasola and Caleb Jeremy Dohu and Gayatri Fagel, who's right here, and Vanessa van der Boega. So please, who will be taking the lead on reading, please? We look forward to hearing. Somebody's muted. Who's ever speaking, could you unmute yourself? Yeah, it's possible that, yeah, Yannick.
We can't hear you.
Perhaps, should we switch? Who's reading?
No. Can't hear you.
Yannick, maybe try taking off your headphones. If you unplug your headphones. Yeah, now we can hear you.
Okay, thank you.
Wonderful, yay.
Thank you so much for this introduction and for giving us the opportunity to share some of our work. This is truly appreciated. Hi everyone, my name is Yannick Bokasola, as you just heard. And with my colleague, Caleb Jeremy Dohu, we are working for ICTD. And we generate knowledge, operationally relevant knowledge in many areas of taxation, including the area of informal taxation, particularly focusing on the informal tax institutions, which is something we are going to talk about a lot today. Next slide, please. So our talk today is focusing on fragile states, and specifically, we would like to shed some light on informal tax institutions and state legitimacy in Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC. So as you know, fragile states have limited capacities, and hence the formal institutions often fail to respond to the legitimate needs and the rights of the populations. And in those settings, such as DRC, where the limited capacity of the states and the ongoing conflict in the country since so many years have together contributed to many challenges, including the proliferation of informal tax payment. So what do we see? We see that, for example, illegal taxes are collected by state officials, and also there are many other actors involved in the tax collections, including customary authorities and armed groups. Next slide. So basically, in this research, we are engaged to understand first, we would like to understand the informal fiscal landscape. Second, the citizen perceptions of formal and informal taxation. And finally, the relationship between informal and formal tax institutions. Next. And to do this, in terms of methodology, we come back, please. Yeah, in terms of methodology, we relied on mixed methods, data from household surveys. We have also conducted interviews with community leaders, traditional authorities, the government representatives, and we have also conducted some focus group discussions with payers across 2 provinces of a DRC. And you can see here for the data, we have quantitative components, which include 811 surveys respondents, and we have on the qualitative component 109 key informant interviews and 12 focus group discussions. And the data were collected between 2017 and 8. Next. So in order to shed light on informal fiscal realities and implications of informal tax institutions for governance and states' legitimacy, we have visited 2 provinces of DRC, and these provinces have 2 different dynamics. So namely, you have Kinshasa, which is in the same time a province and also the capital city of DRC. And we have on the other side the North Kivu province, and as you probably know, this is a conflict affected context, which is the epicenter of the crisis in DRC, and where many armed groups operate. I would like to pass the floor to my colleague, but before that, let me clarify that this study has involved many teams and individuals on the ground. This is not our own work, and so all of them are acknowledged here. Caleb, over to you.
You're muted.
All right. Please, yes.
Yeah.
Okay, please. Thank you. I'll continue as Janet mentioned. Right. So I'll start by providing an overview of our sample regarding formal and informal taxes, as well as the perception of formal authorities' legitimacy to collect taxes. And then I'll move to the regression model and subsequently cover result limitation and further analysis. Please, next slide. Please, next slide. Slide. All right. Okay. So basically, in our sample, regarding formal taxes, as the graph is showing, we have about half of respondents having mentioned that they have paid at least once formal taxes in the past year. We also, the data also show that 3 in 4 respondents have made at least one informal payment in the past year. And we noticed that about 95% of respondents from North Kivu have made at least one payment. So regarding armed group payment for protection, we have about 40% of respondents, which is non-negligible. Please, next. Please, next slide. Okay. All right. Okay. So now coming to the perception of formal and informal taxing authorities, we see that we have relatively high degrees of tax moral and belief in states' right to collect taxes. So about 63% for central government. And to reinforce that, the data shows that 4 in 5 respondents having identified formal authorities as the best actors to respond to the needs of the community. But in contrast, there is significant distrust in how formal institutions manage public funds. So, and on a separate note, I'll just mention that there is high tolerance for tax evasion. Please, next. All right, so these are just two quotes from the qualitative data that confirms the previous slide. So we can move on. All right. So here we use an econometric model, and the regression model is the logistics, and we use odd ratios to interpret our results. So this is the model where we have the dependent variable, which is the state legitimacy to collect taxes. So for this variable, we have different level of administration, such as the central government, provincial government, municipality, and or territory administration. And secondly, for the explanatory variable, we have number of informal taxes paid. So basically, we distinguish between the aggregate number of taxes paid and the different type of taxes paid, namely customary taxes, community development project contribution, and then security payments. So to improve our results, we added some control variables such as conflict exposure, education, age, migrant status, and so on. And we also added some fixed effect for rural or urban area because there are disparities in terms of characteristics in some of the region and also rural versus urban. Basically, okay, I wanted to expand a bit on the definition of each variable, but I think we may do that during the question eventually. Please, forward. Please, next. All right. So basically, these are the results of our analysis. So one of the main results that the study show is that higher informal tax burden were associated with a stronger perception of the legitimacy of formal state institutions, namely customary contribution and community development contribution. So according to the regression, we see that a unit increase in informal taxes induces 11% marginal improvement in perception of legitimacy of formal state institutions. For at the municipal and territory level, there's no statistical significant results, as we can see. Please, next. Okay, to better understand the dynamics, we try to break down in terms of taxes or contribution types. So here our like we can see that types of informal taxes give varying effects on state legitimacy. So the data and the results show that customary contribution is associated with reinforcement of perception of state legitimacy. So, and this type of tax may act as a complementary to formal institutions. To formal institutions. And then second main result is that an increase in security related informal contribution is associated with a reduction in legitimacy of formal institutions, which means when the number of security taxes increases, the population of the communities are more likely to view those taxes as a substitution institution for government. Yeah. Please, next. All right. So in conclusion, from the descriptive and the econometric analysis, we see that the findings are the following. We have high prevalence of informal tax collection across both provinces, meaning Kinshasa and Kivu, and then informal fiscal practices represent a significant burden on citizens, but also it contributes to local public provision. So relationship between informal taxation and citizen perception of state authority is unexpected. Some types reinforce perception of the state legitimacy, but a few play as substitute. So informal institutions, as like the main conclusion, play a more complex role in state building processes. So it's true that helping state institutions through formal payment may not sustain the ability to achieve a long-term processes of state institutions building. So last final slide, please. All right. So these are the limitations of our study. Here we are not using a causal model, so we are not estimating the causal relationship, but just a correlation. And the second caveat is the self-reporting data on informal taxes, which also may imply some underreporting of of informal taxes payment, especially for armed groups. So basically, as further research or analysis, we are considering looking for an instrumental variable approach from the literature or from our data. We are also planning on complementing qualitative data and also compare these results to other contexts, maybe some other countries in fragile states or within the DRC. And finally, we look forward to bring out some insights from the M23 case study. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our third and final paper, titled Informal Contributions and Crises Response, Evidence from Rwanda and Sierra Leone. Vanessa van der Boegelaert, thank you. We'll turn it over to you. Thank you.
Great. Okay. Thank you so much. Really wonderful to be part of this panel. Really enjoyed those presentations. Just sad to not be there in person. It would have been really nice to be with you all today, but thank you for making this possible virtually. In any case, I'm joining you from Toronto today, which is rainy, pretty cold still, waiting for spring. So don't know how it is down there, but so I'm going to be presenting some work that I've undertaken collaboratively with some other colleagues at the International Center for Tax and Development, focusing on the informal ways that people cope through crisis, as well as through daily life in areas of instability and fragility, really with an aim of trying to capture both the fiscal realities of citizens living in contexts of fragility and uncertainty, and what implications these informal modes and methods of self-reliance have for outcomes like equity and fairness and citizens' perceptions of and understandings of the state's responsibilities to them. Part of the motivation for undertaking this project was simply to get a more complete picture of crisis responses in lower income countries, using the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic as a case study. This in part recognized that, whether in crisis or in, so-called normal times in low-income countries, there are often significant revenue and financing gaps in terms of the relief and social protection that states are able or willing to provide citizens. It also recognizes that in many lower income contexts, we know that forms of informal taxation and informal social welfare are prevalent. I think this follows directly from what Yannick and Caleb were describing of this sort of prevalence of informal taxation in some contexts. We know that public goods and services are often funded in part through informal taxes and fees, rather than just through the state. And here, when I'm describing informal taxation, what that refers to are non-market payments that are not required or defined by state law and that are enforced outside of the state legal system. So it's all the stuff that's happening outside of formal taxation. In addition to wanting to just get kind of an understanding of what crisis responses look like, we also wanted to come to a better conceptualization of bottom-up crisis responses in relation to states, given that we saw during the pandemic, but as we also have seen in other crises, states around the world often either implicitly or actually explicitly rely on informal contributions to help fill gaps left by state financing. So during the pandemic in several African countries, we saw states set up solidarity funds, collecting citizen contributions to fund public goods like healthcare. And in many Muslim majority countries, states encouraged the early giving and distribution of zakats, to help address the health challenges, or actually encourage the or distributed zakat that's collected by states and state funds to financing healthcare and other pandemic responses, rather than how it's normally distributed to individuals. So we saw, that states were actively involved in encouraging informal contributions, and that this was also often framed in a positive way, as symbols of solidarity or indicators of social cohesion. And that may well be true, but less attention, I think, has been paid to the equity impacts and the fairness implications of these payments, of having citizens essentially fund some of the state's bill, how citizens perceive these payments, as well as the implications of shifting the burdens of crisis relief and social protection from the state downward to individuals, and often to individuals that are already in a vulnerable position. So in this project, we focused on 4 core research questions. So first, though, our base assumption is that informal contributions in these contexts will be important in crises. It's also possible that given increasing economic constraints, people are less willing or able to contribute. Second, existing research on informal taxation shows that they are often regressive in their impact, meaning that they represent a heavier burden on lower income groups than on higher income groups. But in times of crisis, it could also be true that wealthier individuals, local leaders, politicians, business people step up and contribute disproportionately to informal crisis responses. So we explored those impacts on equity. The third research question then looks at the fact that existing research highlights that informal taxes are often seen as relatively fair, given their embeddedness in trusted informal institutions. Research also shows that informal taxes are often associated with greater reciprocity and accountability than formal taxes. But during times of crisis, it's also possible that new increases or demands on individuals will be seen as more unfair given the economic context. And finally, we wanted to understand how citizens view the role of informal contributions in crisis responses, in relation to the state and relative to other funding sources, including taxation. So on the one hand, we may expect that lower income individuals would be more inclined to think that the state should be more central in crisis responses funded through taxation, given that, at least in theory, they are less likely to be the ones that pay taxes at the national level and may be more likely, again, in theory, to be beneficiaries of tax-based redistribution. But on the other hand, given often positive views of informal tax institutions and negative views and distrust of the state and formal tax system, there may simply be a preference for reliance on informal means of financing crisis responses and public goods more generally. So we consider these questions in two low-income countries that, though both small, differ in really important ways. We look at this in the context of Sierra Leone and Rwanda. Sierra Leone is often considered to be a much weaker state. It has a larger role of customary institutions and authorities in governance and service provision. By contrast, Rwanda is often considered to be a strong, highly centralized state. It has one of the most efficient tax systems on the continent. And it also has an extensive national health insurance program. So it has, more developed forms of formal social protection than we see elsewhere. So within these contexts, we may expect that informal contributions during a time of crisis may be more important in Sierra Leone and perhaps more state-based in Rwanda. Given that we had work ongoing in both countries that predated the pandemic, we were able to make use of pre-existing sampling frames to quickly undertake data collection at the start of the pandemic through phone surveys. So this made it possible for us to track the impacts of the crisis, including the role of informal contributions and individual perceptions of these contributions and how they shifted over time. So we undertook a series of panel surveys throughout 2020 and 2021 to track these impacts and perceptions. In Rwanda, this was with a nationally representative sample of about 2,000 small and medium-sized firms that were registered with the Rwanda Revenue Authority. So these were formal firms. For this data, we have a baseline survey that we conducted in 2020, just prior to the pandemic's effects in Rwanda. And then we subsequently followed up with 3 rounds of data collection using the same sample in May and September 2020, and then again in February 2021. In Sierra Leone, our sample is a bit more complicated because we rely on 2 different sampling frames. One is a random sample of property owners in Freetown, and one is a representative sample of households in 94 communities across all 14 districts in Sierra Leone outside of Freetown. There are important differences in thinking about the urban context of Freetown versus the provinces where customary authority is more important. And in this context, we have 4 rounds of data collection spanning from May 2020 to February 2021. So I'm going to highlight 4 key findings that emerge from this data. The first is that despite major differences across the case studies, and despite the fact that pre-crisis contributions, informal contributions were high in both contexts, new informal contributions to COVID-related projects specifically are also really prevalent in both contexts. During this time period, in both cases, respondents are much more likely to make informal payments than to pay any sort of formal taxes. And this is, again, despite the fact that at least the Rwandan sample that we use is entirely composed of registered taxpayers. So we would expect those to be perhaps paying more taxes than we see. In Rwanda, it's also important to note that most of these new contributions, again, so only talking about crisis-related new burdens on individuals, were related to or were going to community feeding programs. In Sierra Leone, by contrast, we can see that most new informal contributions financed really focused on preventative measures, on funding preventative measures to think about kind of the disease outbreak. So focused on prevention rather than on providing social protection or relief. So we can see there's a high incidence of informal contributions going towards hand washing stations or to community sensitization, but very little in the way of actual social protection or the things like community feeding programs. The second key finding is that these new informal contributions are regressive. So again, this is in line with existing research about informal taxes and contributions in other contexts. We see that lower income groups are paying relatively more in relation to their income than higher income groups. And here's a figure showing the data from Rwanda. So this only focuses on cash contributions. We also capture in-kind and labor contributions, but here we can see just with the cash contributions, a clear decreasing trend in the incidence of contributions as a percentage of income as income increases. In May 2020, informal contributions represented about 19% of income for the bottom quintile, about only 2% for the top one. And it's important to note, again, that these are just for informal contributions for new projects, not counting all of the other informal taxes and fees, which add to this fiscal burden. But notwithstanding this regressivity, in both cases, we find that the probability of making a contribution for new COVID-related projects increases with income. So this suggests that wealthier individuals are more likely to contribute, but to contribute less in relation to their income. And the third key finding is that despite the fact that these informal contributions are regressive, individuals overwhelmingly perceive new informal contributions as fair, and importantly, as fairer than formal taxes. So, for example, at the baseline of our survey, only 67% of respondents in Rwanda saw formal taxes as fair. We can see that perceptions of informal taxes are much higher. And interestingly, in Rwanda, perceptions of fairness, oh, that graph is very blurry, sorry, but perceptions of fairness increased over time, over the course of our data collection. You can't even see that, but those are the 3 periods of data collection from 2020 to 2021. And here the coefficient plots here are really just showing an average increase from baseline of 13% for informal contributions. There's several possibilities for why this may be, of why we may have this sort of paradox of high perceptions of fairness of informal contributions, despite them being a heavy burden and despite them being regressive. First, as I already mentioned, existing literature points to the fact that informal contributions have stronger links to trusted informal institutions, as well as to reciprocity and accountability. We also consider that, at least in Sierra Leone, the legacy of Ebola and experiences of prior pandemics increased popular fears about the COVID-19 pandemic, and therefore increased willingness to contribute, especially to the sort of preventative measures that we saw in that context. And we also see that the pandemic may have increased perceptions of solidarity, of a sense of national solidarity, which in turn may have increased willingness to contribute, or at least the perceptions of the fairness in doing so. So finally, the final finding that I want to highlight today is related to the question of, we asked respondents to think about how crisis responses should be financed, providing a range of tax and non-tax options, with each option independent of each other, so they could answer for multiple of these. And in both cases, in Rwanda and Sierra Leone, we see that people agreed that informal contribution should play a role in financing the recovery. In Rwanda, people felt more strongly about informal contributions than even aid or loans, and certainly we see that preference for informal contributions is much higher than for formal taxes. And in Sierra Leone, informal contributions, they're preferred slightly less than aid or loans, and taxes on the richest, which is somewhat interesting, but preferred above all other tax types. So what can we say overall? I'll just wrap up. I'm sure I'm getting close to time here. First, I think it's important to note that informal contributions were prevalent during the COVID-19 pandemic across these 2 very different cases. We can see that they played an important role in financing crisis responses. But again, at least in Sierra Leone, most informal funding went to preventative measures rather than social protection or relief. So this does suggest that informal contributions did not necessarily fill the gaps left by state relief efforts. Second, surprising, but
We are at time. Yeah. It's okay. We can just quickly go through them because we are at time.
Okay, sorry. This is the last slide. The second kind of summary point is that, unsurprisingly, people don't like or trust formal tax systems, and they don't trust them to finance crisis responses. And this is somewhat interesting even across countries with differing levels of tax capacity. This may be related in part to the normalization of informal taxes and informal social welfare, but it seems to lead to different sort of expectations about what the state should provide. And given high levels of regressivity, relying on these informal financing mechanisms may be problematic as it falls most heavily on lowest income earners. So I think most basically, final point is that while informal financing it will continue to contribute to crisis responses, as well as to kind of normal life in these countries, these case studies should make us question the state's reliance on it, whether again implicitly or explicitly, and at least it points to the need to think about improving the formal tax system in a progressive and accountable and transparent way, so that the burdens are not falling on the poor as they currently are. So I will leave it there. Sorry for running over time, and look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thank you. Okay, thank you so much, everyone on Zoom and here in the room. I didn't introduce myself before, so let me just say my name is Julia Elyachar. I got to drive an hour down the road to come here, and it's great to be with you here today. So I'm not going to take much time because our time is limited, but I just want to offer a few thoughts, just coming from someone who did research on informal economy like 20-30 years ago, even now, when the debate about what was informal economy was really getting going. And also from an interdisciplinary perspective, given all of the fantastic papers that were just presented, and also some of the shifts into the practicalities of moving beyond just like debates about what's formal, what's informal, to actually figuring out the definitions also of informal taxation, which in the early time of the debates was an impossible concept. I mean, tax is the state, tax is the area of the law, and what was informal was something that was somewhere else in the realm of community or in the realm of the non-economic, in the realm of the social. And so while there were, in the old days, when I did this kind of research, there was, it was really international organizations that were involved in then promoting, informal economy as a viable option. And there was that kind of sense of hostility or threat. And then there were early programs that integrated it effectively. So I just want to note that as a historical note, because we're so far beyond that time as these papers make so clear. And so the whole debate also in the papers is really fascinating for me. The very notion of public goods that were for so long in economic theory and then elsewhere were the sphere of the state. And how the notion of local public goods, again, these very concepts are evolving and developing so fast in a way that, again, was not really foreseeable. So, pretty recently. And a few points also that for me were particularly noticeable and interesting in the discussion. In terms of the assumptions that are made in terms of everyday fiscality. Again, fiscality was once upon a time known as a sphere of the state, really, or the fiscal relations of the state with citizens. And now it's so clear that we're beyond that of everyday fiscality. And the assumptions, fiscal systems here are not just the legal systems of fiscal relations of the state, but it's a practice orientation in a way that for me as an economic anthropologist, is very familiar. It's what our practice is of survival, but also of everyday fiscality. And also of the implicit assumptions that are made by some of those systems. And I really appreciated the references in all the papers and the research to, the rhythms and the mismatches between how flows of income that are coming in, going out, all these different spheres of resources that people are living with, and the assumptions of the formal fiscal systems, and also the ways that they've been, changed and remade. The notion of fiscal landscapes also is, for me, really generative and helpful to think with. Yeah, I do wonder, just in terms of the importance and the fascinating nature of the data, that also the incredible amount of data that you guys did in all your papers. I just want to take a moment to express my appreciation and really admiration for the work that that all of you authors have been able to do, and of showing the complexity of this landscape, and in particular moments also where the state stepping in was so important, like with the example of Ebola or of COVID, where both the potential legitimacy of state responses came up again, but that contrast between what's legitimate and what's not legitimate in different contexts was really interesting. So I'm going to leave it at that for now. We're a little compressed for time, and I want to open the floor for questions. We're going to bundle them again, like the last panel. And who would like to start? Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, and it's very illuminating. I have a question about the informal taxation in these places here. What incentives the government, like this in these places here, are providing for those people involved, like this in the informal sector of in these countries, and what would be any kind of policies to stand like this against the corruptions, like just what is the what incentives for those people who are contributing, and what would be like just the opposite, like just for people who fail to report like just their incomes.
So anyone want to, was that question directed at anyone in particular or the whole panel?
Thanks.
Panelists, anyone want to jump in?
I mean, sorry, maybe just a clarification of the question. Are you referring to kind of the incentives for people in the informal sector to formalize?
To report their incomes so that they could get taxes.
I don't know, Miranda, if you have anything to say there, I could, give some general. Our presentation was obviously more related.
Yeah, at first I actually read it in a way being more related to you and the how people are incentivized to actually pay towards these informal taxes, which can, in the classic way, that's a way of actually lessening your own tax burden by giving to charity. I mean, in Bolivia, it's a mixture of, there's kind of like a multi-pronged strategy by the government to encourage people to pay taxes. Amongst higher earners or middle-class earners who have larger, larger profits on their companies or who are publicly employed, it is much harder to evade. And their fines are used as a punitive way to encourage people to pay. But there's also large campaigns to really persuade people to take part in the development of the country and to also become independent from any kind of international aid. So there's a strong discussion about about building the national industry in Bolivia and being nationally independent, which is quite a compelling argument for a lot of people. The thing with Bolivia, and I think this is true, I mean, it varies across the global south, but in Bolivia has such huge wealth in terms of resources, and a lot of the wealth from gas and oil has recently been redirected towards public wealth in a clearer way than previously, and so a lot of universal pension and benefit schemes now come directly from resources rather than from tax receipts. And this is something that people are very aware of, and something that the government also talk about a lot. Like, one of the things that the Evo Morales government has succeeded in doing is to keep some of this resource wealth in the country and invested it into national public goods. And so people don't feel like their tax money is the most important thing. What was important was a fight to keep their resources, and that's what's being invested in the country. So taxes is kind of this step-by-step way of saying, okay, well, how do we increase our independence and how do we invest in our national infrastructure? So at the moment, there's these kind of quite abstract incentives, as well as these punitive measures for evasion. But there's very little incentive kind of in terms of direct fiscal benefits or direct benefits for paying taxes. So because there's very little public goods coming your way, or reciprocity that the state is delivering that isn't funded by resource money. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thank you so much. We have a follow-up. Oh, okay, yeah.
yeah, I would
Please.
like, sorry. Yeah, I would like to add just one quick point regarding the DSC context. My experience is that the transition from the informal sector to the formal is not easy. Yeah, even if the government needs that. The challenge we are facing is that, people are who they are, and it's not easy to change the behavior over the time. For instance, in other study we have with Vanessa here, many people who are working in the informal market state that they are not ready to go and to work on the formal market because they think that the administration process are so tricky for them. But as just Miranda said, I think that the government needs to continue with, like to mobilize people and to conduct some campaigns. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much. I think, yes, please, let's have one follow-up question. We have time for that.
Hi, I'm Bernardo Torres from UCL. I have a question for the presenter about Bolivia taxation system. I will ask if, in your experience, you consider this is another stage of the taxation. Like for the first stage of the Evo Morales government, for example, there was a lot of improvement over there, but right now, maybe because of the political instability, internal crisis in the Morales party, which as the president right now, would you say like there is another step that is not completed from the taxation reform that was planned at the beginning of his campaigns and political movement?
I'm just going to bundle if there's another question in the audience. And then also invite panelists, since you don't get to be in the same room together. If any of you want to ask each other questions, we also have room for that. If there's another question to be added to the mix. If not, let's proceed with the answer. Yeah, do you have a question?
Yeah.
Okay, please, we're going to add one more question. Yeah.
I feel like I've done this. Yeah, this is like one of my ideal panels, so I'm going to take advantage. So I think I had a question. I think first for Vanessa, just the Rwanda example is so interesting as to one of the most competitive, one of the most competent states, and yet there's this preference for informal contributions, funding, and providing sort of social protection, as you said. So I think if you can explain what do you think may explain the situation, or what do you think is contributing to it, that would be really interesting to understand. And I think, I guess for everyone, but also I think more for Miranda, I think we've talked about it in different ways, but like in terms of just this understanding of does it matter what kind of tax? Is the question, is it like which tax matters for understanding of like where people are willing to pay versus where they're like willing to exit? And then this whole idea of exit from the state. So I think that's a theme, right? Like which we constantly have to grapple with, and what Professor Elyachar was also talking about is this idea that now there's an established idea that, okay, informality has always existed. It's not something new. It's just gotten an acknowledgement. But it also, I think, for us trying to understand how state-society relations have evolved, the preference, the increasing preference for, or if, I don't know, I guess that's the question. And that's something that Vanessa was kind of indicating, is that there seems to be a continuing preference in the DRC. Of course, it seems like from our analysis, it's very much the case that informality has existed also to compensate for state. So it serves as a complement in some ways, but it also serves as a substitute. So I think this idea of exiting from the state is that, and the inability to have this kind of social contractual framing. And if, I guess, do we need a different framing? And are we coming up with those framings based on what is happening empirically and how taxes and fiscal sociality is being understood? Yeah, so thank you.
Thank you. So responses, first to our first question.
So I didn't quite hear the end of the first question. I think I heard Bolivia at one point, so I feel like it was partially directed at me, but I missed what the...
I don't know if that's the question.
Highlight of the show.
Well, yeah, the question was related if your experience, your organic research, you consider like the original proposal from the Morales party and their original proposal about taxation policies, if it has been completed, because right now I think there is a political instability over there, internal crisis in the party.
Yeah.
So if this has stopped the original taxation policies. Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you. I mean, there's loads and loads to say about like the current situation in Bolivia and what the Morales project and the MAS project succeeded with and didn't succeed with. I think there's quite a kind of consensus amongst many of my colleagues and research participants in Bolivia that it has been disappointing, but disappointing and also incredibly divisive and problematic now towards the end, saying that many years during the Morales government and during the MAS government did actually make significant changes that changed the country in terms of redistribution, in terms of keeping resources in the country, in terms of national investment, that did make a huge difference to the economic stability, to existent racist hierarchies. So there has been interventions by the MAS government that I think were successful in lots of ways and did go some way to their aims. And then there's lots that's fallen apart and a lot of damage that has also been done in recent years. And there is huge instability now. Maybe while I'm on, I'll keep talking and then hand over to Vanessa and Caleb and Yannick. I just want to say that, in response to Gayatri's questions, I think this idea of what is taxable and different taxes is really fascinating. What people accept taxation on, what they think are moments of taxability, what kind of wealth they feel willing to have taxes extracted from. Is it when wealth moves? Is it when wealth is seen to grow? That what are these moments that people agree to are taxable moments, and how do we come to these consensus? I think is one of the really fascinating things that tax studies and interdisciplinary work on tax can do. In Bolivia, it was definitely, in the same in Sweden and in the UK, where I've also been doing fieldwork the last few years, it is very clear that different people feel very differently about different taxes. And this idea that taxes is one big kind of revenue stream that we all bundle together isn't true. So in Bolivia, for instance, people were very keen on paying property taxes. And this now also ties into answering a bit of Gayatri's second question. The payment of property taxes was not in order to pay the state and enter into a social contract with the state. People paid property taxes because this shored up their right to their private property in a kind of market of a lot of property disputes. So having tax receipts on your properties meant that you had a greater stake to that piece of land than a lot of other people who might also have quite formal documentation making claims to that land, especially in peri-urban neighborhoods where land often is parceled up So they go from rural to urban designation, they're parceled and chopped up and then sold sometimes multiple times for what's called loteadores, so people who kind of speculate on land and resell land. So you have these like areas where there are huge land disputes, and most of the time whoever has the receipt of taxes paid has the greatest claim. So in this case, paying taxes does something other than pay into kind of taking part in a social contract. And this is something that I've written about, and I think it's really interesting because it does problematize the whole social contract relationship and our model about what taxes are. In this case, taxes in a way provided independence for people and less reliance on the state. If they had strong claims on private land, they were able to survive partly through informal taxes like Vanessa and Caleb and Yannick talked about, and partly through private wealth in a situation where the state does not provide. So different taxes do different things, and they can have utilitarian purposes beyond kind of a social contract with the state. And they also feed into different ideas about property and about labor. And I think, I mean, I'd also like to ask Vanessa about this. I think it's really fascinating how the idea of progressive and regressive redistribution really doesn't upset people so much when it comes to these informal things. And it's the same, I found the same in Bolivia and also the same in the UK. People don't expect progressive redistribution within these circles, which is fascinating because, you know, it's so obvious that progressive redistribution is fairer, and yet it is not the call that people make on these systems, and not even sometimes on official tax systems. But coming back to Julia's points, I think that the informal thing and like how do we actually define taxes is another thing that tax studies is, you know, a really interesting thing about tax studies at the moment, that there is something special about taxes as defined by states because they are backed up by a certain kind of violence and certain laws that creates a rigidity that people cannot avoid. Yet at the same time, we have these other so-called informal taxes or other ways of sharing that in many ways much better onto how we might define taxes as an exchange. So we have a lot of tribute and extraction of resources by the state in ways that don't seem to be tax-like, yet have official definition of taxes behind them. And I think it's fascinating to look at both taxes narrowly defined and widely defined to think about fiscal lives. So we shouldn't lose sight of the state and the role of state taxes as defined by states, as we also look at these other forms of sharing that mimic or fit onto kind of our own models of fiscal relations. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the answer. Is there anyone else in the panel who wants to have a final comment in reply to any of the questions? Please.
Yeah,
just because we are over time, yeah. But please, yeah.
Okay, I just wanted to reply to Gayatri's question.
Please do. Please.
Yeah, yeah, I'll try to make it short, though. I think it's something we could talk about for a long time, but I think it is really interesting, particularly in the Rwanda case, of kind of this preference, as you noted, for informal contributions, even in this case of a relatively strong tax state. And again, given that the sample that we were looking at is formal firms. And I think it really just really emphasizes the points that I think has come up in all of the presentations of the sort of lack of reciprocity that people are getting for the taxes that the formal taxes they pay, the lack of public goods provision, and recognizing that this is even the case in Rwanda, which again is a higher income country that has this stronger states. For anyone that's visited Kigali, there's all sorts of nice shiny things and infrastructure projects, but the reality is that basic goods for people, their basic needs are still not being met and are met instead through these informal channels. I think that some of that relates to kind of a reliance over time, kind of a shifting expectation of what the state will provide, right? Like people don't have trust that the state is actually going to give them something in return for the taxes they pay. And I think that shifts over time, kind of expectations of what the state should provide. So it's kind of this reliance on informal systems becomes so much the norm and so much kind of the expectation that people aren't making demands of the state in the way that, as an outsider, I might expect they would, that they might be angrier that they're not getting something from the state, but, they've had their heart broken by the state too many times. But I do think the thing that want to really emphasize or try to emphasize in the presentation is kind of the risk of romanticizing these informal systems too much, right? There is often discussion of that these are, you know, they are crucial for informal social welfare, and that they're, you know, representative of these, you know, ideas of social solidarity and community. And again, all of that is true, but they do still have these kind of negative equity implications. Now, it's complicated. It's more complicated in the context of Rwanda, of course, because I think that's, you know, the alternative of investing more in the formal tax system, you know, has implications for strengthening what is an authoritarian state that is not treating people equally, both within and outside of its borders. So I think that, you know, it's complicated in terms of, you know, what the alternative looks like. But I think, you know, maybe also to you know, quickly touch on Miranda's point, which I think is a really good one, and I think, yeah, there's some really nice parallels between very different case contexts, is kind of this kind of understanding of like what people think is fair. And I think, you know, as someone that studies tax, you know, I'm coming in with my own ideas that a progressive system is what we should be aiming for. But, you know, I think the reality that when we actually talk to people and capture their perspectives of understanding that they might have different ideas, that it's fair for everyone to contribute, that this is a sense of communal solidarity, that, you know, even the poorest should be contributing something. And I think that really emphasizes, I think, just the value of capturing and listening to people's perspectives of fairness, which is, you know, comes out so strongly in your work, Miranda, as well, with your really, really wonderful anthropological perspective of kind of capturing those ideas of fairness, and what is, you know, when is it fair to tax something? When is it a fair taxable moment? So yeah, I just really want to emphasize how great your work is in that regard. I know we're short on time. Maybe later, I would like to hear your thoughts on, you know, what some of the informal workers in the Bolivian context would see as a fair system of presumptive taxation, right? That recognizes more kind of the variability and seasonality of income, and how that might actually be structured. But that might be something that I follow up on if we're out of time.
We wish that we could invite all of you online to join everyone here for lunch, which I think it's time for us to move to. But maybe I hope that everyone who wasn't able to make it here also will continue to be in conversation. And thank everyone for their wonderful contributions and for the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much.